Great question. I'll just slide. Usually they're walking.
Done for the day? Yeah, that's exactly right. There are a lot of they're selling a product in there. Here. 406, are you stepping? Does work a bit. So the way we have everything, especially with you have to hear because she can advance the slides. So I can for her. She can advance it, but for PDF, whenever you bring it, it goes up. Okay, I'm John King. Nice to meet you. We're just trying to figure out how to get your presentation up. It'll allow you. It goes on this side. Okay. Okay. It means whatever is shown on this screen is showing on. Excellent. Extension. Okay, well then, how does she advance her slides? You go. Oh. Would it advance with this? All right. Thank you very much.
You'll have the.
Yes,
Okay. That will be. Yeah. Okay. All right. Now you don't have to read.
Everybody hear me okay? Great, it's a big room. Like still accommodates pandemic spacing. Well, I hope everyone has had a good day so far. I think we have 45 minutes together. I'll try to keep a steady pace, not too fast and not too slow. Get through all the material. And we will get started. And we're here to talk about navigating environmental justice in the environmental permitting process, which is really, can't emphasize enough, one of an ongoing process and endeavor for regulated entities, state agencies, and I think to some extent that for even the federal government to really put the right emphasis and path forward on how to best integrate environmental justice in the permitting process. So I like to joke that when I do PowerPoints, I break the PowerPoint rule, which is I put too many words on one page. I'm not good at graphics. So I also, and sometimes I think it's important to capture the words because the words matter. So big picture for environmental justice, I'm going to mention one thing that's not on the slide, which is environmental justice is not a new concept. We've heard a lot more about it with the current administration under President Biden. When he was running for office, it was a centerpiece, and certainly when he took office, one of the first things that he did was to make this a feature of his administration. But the one, I believe the very first executive order addressing environmental justice was back during the Clinton administration, and that was in 1994, Executive Order 12898. And the concept of environmental justice dates back really to the late 60s, when you had the convergence of the Civil Rights Act, all the things that we think about the 60s with civil rights impacts in society, and then carrying forward into the future. We all know what year it is. It's 2023, and in a lot of respects, some of the same issues are still being worked through this many years after, certainly after the enactment of the Civil Rights Act. The first bullet is pulled from Biden's Executive Order 14008. And I mentioned the specific number because there are actually two of them. The one I didn't mention is actually entitled Advancing Racial Equity. But it's the one I mentioned, the 14008, which is entitled Tackling the Climate Crisis at Home and Abroad, that really kind of sets the foundation for how, as the words say, in environmental justice is a mission of every agency by directing federal agencies to develop these programs to address the disproportionate health, environmental, economic, and climate impacts on disadvantaged communities. 2 years later, and just, I think everyone appreciates this, but January 20th, 2021, it was first day in office, basically. And then about 2 years later, there's an additional executive order that further advances racial equity and support for underserved communities. And I think some of these, emphasizing some of the excerpts that I've pulled, achieving racial equity and support for underserved communities is not a one-time project. So the goal of this presentation is to basically set the stage for discussing what is a civil rights Title VI action or complaint versus environmental justice, because they are rooted in different foundations. So we have the 1964 Civil Rights Act, and there's two components to it, which are, fundamentally, federal agencies are required to ensure that all programs and activities that receive financial assistance do not discriminate against recipients based on race, color, or national origin. I've highlighted there's intentional discrimination, which I think we all have a pretty good idea of what that is. It's a disparate or different treatment of individuals of a protected class versus a disparate impact, which is really an activity that has a discriminatory effect. Fundamentally, if you see a Title VI complaint today, it's not a claim brought for intentional discrimination. It's very often going to be in the context of an action or a steps taken that it is alleged there's a discriminatory effect. And let me go ahead and give a little bit more context too on when we talk about the Civil Rights Act and how it really connects over to what we're talking about today, which is environmental permitting, which you take TCEQ, the Texas Commission on Environmental Quality, which is the state environmental agency, which implements all the federal programs, Clean Water Act, discharge permitting, the RCRA program, the Federal Clean Air Act, New Source Review, Title V. All these federal programs are basically handled by TCEQ with some oversight by EPA Region 6. TCEQ has a pretty significant budget. I want to say it's on the magnitude of 400 million. Most of those dollars are derived from fees paid by regulated entities. So in other words, it's not an agency that's heavily dependent on general revenue from the state. It's primarily fee funded. It is also the recipient of federal grant funds from EPA. So that is I call it the hook for a community that feels that there's been and I'm just going to focus on the discriminatory effect because that's what typically we, what will be of concern. That is the context for a community member or a group filing a Title VI complaint with EPA alleging that there's been a violation of the Civil Rights Act. Environmental justice, again, rooted in a different context. It's not a federal law or statute. It is defined as the fair treatment and meaningful involvement of all people, regardless of race, color, national origin, or income with respect to the development, implementation, and enforcement of environmental laws, regulations, and policies. I'm going to say one thing about all of this is that when you think about environmental permitting and environmental justice and discrimination, typically whether it's in an informal conversation with a community member or whether it's a conversation with EPA, is that it's really about the inclusion of the voices of the community in an agency's decision. So whether that's a federal agency or a state agency, I think typically that's where at its core, that is what matters to community members, is that they feel like they have a voice in that decision. I'm going to build on that a little bit throughout the discussion here. We talked about the one thing that's not mentioned here, but I'm going to go ahead and note it now. When we talk about the Biden administration and the prioritization of kind of reinvigoration of environmental justice, I think we are all familiar with the term Justice 40. So Justice 40, which is derived from the executive order I previously referenced, just to make sure we all really know what Justice 40 means. It's 40% of the overall benefits from federal investments in climate and clean energy, making sure that those benefits flow to disadvantaged communities. So now you can actually see why it's that one executive order about climate and disadvantaged or burdened communities. And it's not, I didn't say 40% of dollars, I said 40% of benefits of climate and clean energy. The very last bullet, is basically if you were to go and type environmental justice and EPA, this will be one of the first things that pops up, which is EPA's webpage on environmental justice. And they've got a lot of good information there about EPA and its programs, federal dollars. So it's got good information. So I wanted to make sure I mentioned the website. This slide is actually pulled from EPA's website. On this same web page at the very bottom, there is a timeline that will kind of step you through the environmental justice movement, and it echoes some of the things that we've talked about, which is you have the 1964 Civil Rights Act, you have segregation and desegregation, and you see it happening in communities. The environmental justice, as I mentioned, is like really in the late 1960s when there was a sanitation strike in Memphis. Is kind of, I think, seen as the beginnings, the origins of environmental justice. And I only pulled this slide. There's a couple of other, timelines of different cases and instances, but this one I flagged because it's here in Texas. It's Houston. This is in 1979. And so as everyone can read on the slide, it's basically residents filed a lawsuit alleging discrimination under the Civil Rights Act. And so the very last sentence captures the outcome, which is, that it didn't fail to prevent the construction of this landfill, but it also kind of further emphasized how alleged discrimination, is pulled forward and seen in the environmental context. And there's one other interesting point on the EPA's website, and I think it helps a little bit because there's so many terms that get used in environmental justice: disproportionate impact, cumulative impact, overburdened community. And to try to, I have to kind of lift up a little bit and try to come at it more simplistically, and then maybe try to come down into the detail, because there's so much information on the topic of environmental justice. I have my, I'm just going to, I actually do like paper, but this is also, I think visual aids are still useful. This is my notebook on environmental justice issues, and it's really just in the last 2 years or so. So there's a lot of information out there. It's very difficult sometimes to keep up and kind of keep it straight and understand how it all fits together. But the stats that are referenced on this one slide, I think, help with overburdened community. And this is actually from, I believe it's back in the early 80s. And it was also a study featured on Houston. And basically, the study went and looked at the location of city-owned landfills, garbage incinerators. It's kind of interesting. You think like we're in 2023, and like, how long ago was that? Well, he still has a garbage incinerator for managing municipal solid waste. But all the city landfills, 5 of them, 80% of garbage incinerators, 75% of privately owned landfills, were located in African-American neighborhoods, which represented 25% of the population. So I think that kind of sort of helped me, in prepping for this and other conversations I've had about environmental justice, to kind of think about what is disproportionate impact? What does that mean? I'm like, well, that kind of captures the issue. I don't know that it's quite as, I think depending on where you go in the United States and which community, and the really challenging part about environmental justice is these are decades-long generational actions that have been taken that we are still dealing with basically in 2023. I actually have another panel discussion coming up. We were prepping some on Friday, and I hadn't described it this way before, but without saying my age, I will just say that, you think about the 60s, the Civil Rights Act. Well, my parents were, they grew up in the Depression. Okay, so they went to college, in the 50s in the South. And my mom was from Wisconsin, right? So Louisiana, Wisconsin, very different in the 50s, but still pronounced segregation, when my parents were alive. And I commend them. I feel very strongly that I was raised to not have those kinds of beliefs. I came, my school experience was different from probably those who, went to school 5-10 years before. So that informs my view on this topic. And I think going forward, the more that we all kind of learn through this process, we all kind of advance on our views on how to handle the situation. But inherently, an individual permit, which is often what TCEQ or a regulated entity is going to have, one individual permit for which there are concerns raised about environmental justice, is taking on quite a bit to try to, what is the answer, which we kind of get to in our very last slide. What are ways in which you can try to address environmental justice? I'm including this slide because now we were very high, right? We were general, trying to get our heads around disproportionate burden, disproportionate impacts. And then we're going to come back down into 2023 where there's a lot of dollars, federal dollars that are available through EPA and their newly formed office, the Inflation Reduction Act, for example. There's also different screening tools. So this White House Council on Screening tool, this is a screening tool. We've probably heard a little bit about EPA, EJ Screen. Well, this is a cousin of sorts of EJ Screen. And it's used for the Justice 40 federal dollars that I talked about. I'm not going to go through all of it, but when we're trying to lift up a little bit higher to have a general understanding, and then you come back down to the detail of it, we're talking about census tracts, we're talking about socioeconomic indicators, a lot of data. It's basically not an IT person, but if you think about your GIS versus layers and layers of data on a map, that's what these screening tools are. You can also see, when it talks about the different federal programs, there's 146 covered programs. EPA has 73. And these covered federal programs, and again, we're talking about the investments and the benefit. There are 7 categories, including climate change, clean energy, and remediation. I think y'all may have heard from some of the speakers today about CCS, carbon capture, sequestration. So those, the Department of Energy, significant dollars available for investing in CCS projects. This process is what DOE has. EPA has had an EJ screen for quite some time. They came out recently in October of 2022 with EJ Screen 2.1. And it basically adds another layer of detail. You start hearing terms about, I believe the terminology is chemical stressor and non-chemical stressors. So it's what you think of in terms of a screening tool, which is socioeconomic, proximity, concentration of industry. And you basically look at these indicators and then you come up with a relative percentage. And then you're trying to make some, again, another one is language barriers. For informing on, is your site, is your proposed, activity or current activity, where does it figure into the community and some of these criteria that inform on environmental justice, potential environmental justice or Title VI concerns. The other boxes, kind of getting to the volume of the notebook here, is a lot of, all the states have different policies. Like, for example, I believe it's New Jersey, they have environmental justice state law. Texas does not have an environmental justice independent state law authority. But EPA, I think in response to community, to inform for federal agencies, to inform for states, they issued in May of 2022 legal tools to advance environmental justice. And it basically steps through all their different federal programs and identifies ways in which what I'll call like the organic environmental law, which may have been enacted in about the same time frame, a few years after the Civil Rights Act, is how the federal law has authority independent of, I would say, the Civil Rights Act for addressing discriminatory effects. And it's a lot of it is, for people who know 404 permits, dredge and fill permits, there's the 404B1 mitigation analysis and cumulative impacts. That is specifically called out as like, hey, here's a federal law that specifically addresses cumulative impacts. Well, not all of the different federal permitting programs have that same mitigation sequence or referencing to cumulative impacts. The next document that is actually, it's worthy of a read is in August of 2022 is the EPA and Civil Rights and Permitting FAQs document. And that was issued by at the time, the External Civil Rights Compliance Office in EPA's Office of General Counsel, because it predated the creation of the new office dedicated to advancing environmental justice and civil rights. The importance of what happened in September 2022 is you think about the Office of Air, Office of Waste, and they have the assistant administrators. Those are appointed positions that have to go through Senate confirmation and Congress. So basically what this has done is kind of, you've elevated a function and given it its own office and kind of independence, so they're side by side, if you will, with the Office of Air, Office of Compliance and Enforcement, et cetera. This is also pulled from EPA's website. Like very first thing you see when you type in what I recommended before is going to be this photo with Administrator Regan. And I mean, again, I can't emphasize enough, the dollar amounts are staggering. It's 100 million. 100 billion. I didn't get to spend a lot of time on an article that I saw pop up last Friday. That is a lot of money to push out the door. And so the concern now is that EPA is not able to, they're at percent-wise, they're not pushing out the dollars as fast. Because if you think about it, I'm going to kind of go back in time to the days at TCQ. Anytime a state or federal agency is providing grant dollars, those dollars need to be used for the purpose intended. So you got to have the necessary tools there. Basically, the recipient has to be held accountable, so to speak. So it's basically setting up a program, making sure there's like I'll call it the checks and balances. Internal auditors, you guys work in any organization, we have internal auditors. This is what they do. They go in and make sure that, a state agency or an organization is using their dollars as appropriate. You got to have the framework in place to distribute these dollars. That's my theory and why it might be taking a little bit longer, plus just the process of getting, folks to apply, time for people to apply, time for EPA to review and then select. Of course, the deadline is April 10th, 2023. I'm losing track of time. I think we're, what day is today? So I know it's Wednesday, the 5th. So the deadline's coming up. This is a little bit more on the impact of the dollars. I mentioned the inflation. This also includes not just the Inflation Reduction Act, but the American Rescue Plan. This is announced, it's $100 million available. This is 53.4 million of recipients, 132 projects in 37 states. And then after that, I've tried to break it down. And this is, candidly, this is about 2 months old, at least. You do presentations and you keep trying to build on each presentation. And then at some point you got to go back an update. So I will say that this may not be the most current, but it's without question the last 6 months, 4 months. But we're here in Texas, so I'm highlighting some of the recipients, and this is all information on the World Wide Web. City of Houston, Port Arthur Community Action Network, and you can kind of sort of see where the dollars are being directed. Air monitoring, air pollutant sensors. Maybe I should say air monitoring one more time. So, and then the very last piece, which is all the dollars above or in addition to 22.5 million in direct awards to air agencies for monitoring of PM fine and other NAAQS regulated pollutants. So if you follow environmental issues in Texas and TCEQ, which can be subject to criticism. I'm a little biased. I think the TCEQ does a very good job of administering complicated, complex, important, both federal environmental programs and state. They have a comprehensive air monitoring network. Houston, Dallas, San Antonio, Austin, they have to because it's required. The air monitoring networks to determine compliance with the NAAQS. I would say that they go above and beyond with placement of monitors to try to be responsive. It's particularly, I would say, in the last 5 years or so, to try to be responsive to communities where there is concern about concentrations of air emissions. This slide, dated here, so we know it's vintage. October of 2022. I pulled this one and with all the letters and acronyms. EPA, we all know that one. OIG. What did I talk about before about grant dollars, internal auditors? This is the Office of Inspector General. So basically, this is like the group that sits in the office of within EPA to basically kind of track performance and challenges of the Environmental Protection Agency. So this is fiscal year 2023. I think EPA's fiscal year starts in August. Top management challenges, integrating and leading EJ across the agency and government. Third rectangular box here. EPA cannot fully identify where disproportionate health effects exist without identifying cumulative impacts. It can be scientifically and legally complicated to address cumulative impacts from and interactions between, and then here's my terminology that I mentioned before, chemical and non-chemical stressors. So this is the Inspector General basically acknowledging that this is a significant management challenge for EPA. IRA, the Inflation Reduction Act dollars are fully appropriated in fiscal year 2022 and include $3 billion in environmental climate justice block grants to fund community-based nonprofit programs. And then again, talking about there's $50 million for grants, other activities, and technical assistance to monitor and reduce air pollution, et cetera. I won't read the rest of the box to y'all because you can read it. But I keep coming back to the money part of this because the dollars are going to, this is not a, personal observation is, what we see in the last 15 years or so is that there's one 4-year EPA, and then there's another 4-year EPA, then there's another 4-year EPA that takes you back to the previous version of the EPA. The dollars here are going to flow for longer. They are going to, so the purposes for which the dollars have been granted are going to be in place. They are intended for the communities. So I would contend that communities are going to continue to utilize the dollars and the data to bring forward their concerns about, an activity and the impacts in the community. Here we have another form of guidance coming from EPA, the EJ toolkit and best practices. Because now I'm trying to get to the part where we said we were going to talk about, what do we do with all this information? So first bullet is hugely important. So for those of you who are familiar with some of the prominent names with EPA and environmental justice, so Lillian Sotolonga Dorca, she's an amazing person, was on did a panel with her last August. And she says it frequently. It's in the materials that she presents. This is a takeaway. Compliance with environmental laws does not necessarily constitute compliance with federal civil rights laws. And that right there is the tension of the job of TCEQ. The NSR permit that was the application that was submitted went through administrative review, technical review, backed, emission screening, did some modeling. You met all the requirements for issuance of that NSR permit. What this says is you can meet the NSR requirements, but that doesn't necessarily constitute compliance with federal civil rights laws. And so now we're going to try to merge the, per the toolkit, when are there potential civil rights concerns early in the permitting process? Okay, is there the potential to cause or contribute to public health and environmental impacts? It's pretty broad. Does the affected community have particular vulnerabilities to any adverse effects of the proposed permitting action? Remember, there are chemical stressors and non-chemical stressors. So you can look at, if there's, what are the health trends, if you will, in the community? What are those socioeconomic factors? Is the affected community already disproportionately bearing public health or environmental burdens? Let's go back to the slide where I mentioned, how many industrial facilities are in the vicinity of the community? This slide, I want to be able to do a tangible example of a Title VI complaint. This was all things, there's a saying in the law, bad facts make bad law. Well, there was a public meeting, at least according to the website. If you go to the web, you can find information about a particular meeting that kind of sort of, according to what folks have said on the internet, kind of propelled a petition for rulemaking in a Title VI complaint. And this was back in 2019. I believe that this came to TCEQ. What happened at the public meeting is that the attendees couldn't speak English, and the folks presenting the information, the folks presenting the information didn't have a translator. That end of story. And hindsight 2020 could have been handled better. I don't know. I wasn't there at the public meeting. Could there have been some actions, some steps taken in advance? I don't know. But what happened was there was a petition for rulemaking, and that resulted in changes to the agency's public participation rules. And the terminology is limited English proficiency. So putting in place tools to address those citizens with limited English proficiency, which includes having translators, which includes translating certain documents. If you go to TCEQ's website 2 years ago, you saw, an English version website. Today, you will see, and not every community, we think in Texas it's Spanish. It's more than Spanish, but what you see more readily translated, the agendas, TCEQ's agendas now are all, English and Spanish. That is an outcome of this complaint and this process, because it was the rulemaking and it was the complaint. And so the complaint, in order to resolve the complaint with the EPA, TCEQ took certain steps that were kind of intertwined and related to the rulemaking. So rules in place, and I mentioned a website, I keep saying that today, but TCEQ, if you type TCEQ Title VI Civil Rights, this website will pop up and you'll be able to see the different elements in there to assure compliance with Civil Rights Act. There's a public participation plan, which, you know, the second box here. Then there's what's called a public involvement plan. And I'm highlighting the public involvement plan because this is new and this applies to a new permit or a new activity. So you can have an existing permit and then go amend it for a new activity. I see some folks are nodding like, yeah, I know about this. You basically go through this form and it breaks down by, it calls out certain regions of the state that if you're a new thing and you're in like Houston, San Antonio, I don't think Corpus is listed. But if you're this and this, keep going through the public involvement plan, because now you're going to look at using a tool like EJ Screen, et cetera, whether there should be more or less additional public involvement. What are the plans currently in place for engaging the community? So what did I talk about before? It's just like members of the community, they just want to be heard and have a say in that permitting decision. That's what this formal process is really about. It's just much more formalized. And I think I'm on the last page of my presentation, which is probably good because I think about 5 minutes. And I have broken the rule again. I started out with a lot of words on one page and I'm closing it out with a lot of words on one page. But I wanted to highlight what EPA identifies because, you know, Lillian said, and it's in the EPA, you know, materials, that compliance with environmental law does not equate to civil compliance with the Civil Rights Act. So I've pulled these particular questions because I think they're informative about, you know, what are some ways in which a regulated entity might approach a proposed project or a permitting application. Pre-application discussions, conducting an early EJ screen. Well, the agency has its public involvement plan. Kind of getting to the first bullet here. And then go on to the second bullet. Although they may overlap, conducting EIG analysis will not satisfy Title VI requirement. The analysis used to evaluate whether a recipient's action has an adverse and disproportionate impact is this disparate impact, which again is a discriminatory effect. So what is that discriminatory effect of the action? Well, okay, there's an amendment to build an additional unit. It increases the emissions. In and of itself, it's not intentional discrimination. Does it have a discriminatory effect? Well, I have to go look at, you know, the community. So you can see how, you know, very quickly and complicated this can become, and trying to tease out, and then how to be positioned to address the concern. Thank you. 5 minutes. A disparate impact analysis looks whether recipients' criteria or methods of administering its program adversely and disparately affect members of a group identified by race, color, and national origin. All right, so what do we do about the community where it is predominantly minority? And there is, you know, concentration of industry. The FAQs start then to get into, you know, what are some things that can be done in the permit. And some of it can be, for example, they call it mitigation measures. So I already said that in the NSR world, and I think folks in this room appreciate this. You've met backed, you've demonstrated that, you know, the modeling. What, you know, does a company want to consider these? Continuous compliance monitoring equipment. Is that something that addresses the community concerns? Because it demonstrates compliance with that permit, which at the end of the day, that's the thing that matters. What about additional pollution controls and more stringent limits? You know, I'm going to throw out one more question without the answer. What if the company says, okay, I'll do a more stringent emission limit to address the community concern? What happens if the community in the company still don't see quite eye to eye on what the appropriate, more stringent limit is. You know, a lot of times these permits may be appealed in the courts. So at the end of the day, building the record is going to be what matters. And it's just going to be a lot more record to build out when you start taking into account some of the Title VI civil rights concerns. Work practices for minimizing emissions. You know, in the landfill context, expansion of buffers and modification of operational hours. I mean, that for landfills, that was well appreciated, that if you could increase the buffer and adjust your operating hours, that would be well received by the community. I think I'm going to stop there in case there are any questions, and probably I'm also almost out of time. 2 minutes or so. I was supposed to help provide answers. I don't know if I provided answers. Maybe things to think about. Thank you. Appreciate it. TCQ does have a lot of good information, so I recommend that you look at their website to learn more. Thank you. Yep. Down the street. Okay. Perfect.